Step out of the vehicle, now. The command cracked through the night like a whip. Reverend Elijah Brooks tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale under the flickering red and blue lights splashing across the windshield. The engine was already off, the window already down. His hands were visible, resting exactly where every police safety seminar said they should be. Still, the officer's hand stayed glued to his holster. Elijah swallowed, slowly, carefully. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice calm, practiced, respectful in the way black men learned early, or learned too late. He opened the door and stepped onto the shoulder of Highway 17, the humid South Carolina night clinging to his skin. Traffic hissed past in the distance, pine trees loomed like silent witnesses. The officer moved closer than necessary, too close. "What were you doing swerving back there?" the officer snapped. Elijah blinked. "Sir?" "You heard me." The officer's flashlight beam cut across Elijah's face, lingered on his chest, then dropped deliberately to his hands again. "You were drifting between lanes. That's suspicious behavior." Elijah took a slow breath. "I don't believe I was, officer. I signaled to merge around a stalled vehicle." "Don't argue with me," the officer barked. "I asked what you were doing, not for a sermon." The word sermon landed heavier than it should have. Elijah's jaw tightened for half a second before he smoothed it away. "Yes, sir," he said again. The officer circled him like a man inspecting damaged goods. Late 40s, square jaw, patrol badge catching the light, his name tag read H. Dalton. "You live around here?" Dalton asked. "I do, Charleston County. Just finished an evening visit with a church member." "Church, huh?" Elijah didn't respond. Dalton leaned toward the open car door, peering inside. His flashlight swept over the passenger seat, the back seat, the floorboard. It paused. On a worn black leather Bible resting on the passenger seat. The officer's eyes narrowed. "What's that?" Dalton asked. Elijah followed his gaze. "My Bible." Dalton straightened slowly. "You carry that around?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" Elijah hesitated, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he knew from long experience that the wrong tone could turn this night into something much worse. "I'm a pastor," he said quietly. "I keep it with me." Dalton chuckled, a sound with no humor in it. "A pastor." He said it like a challenge. "You expect me to believe that?" Elijah met his eyes. "I don't expect anything, officer. It's simply the truth." Dalton's smile faded. "Hands behind your back." The words landed like a slap. Elijah's heart thudded once, hard. "Sir?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "Am I being detained?" Dalton stepped in closer, close enough that Elijah could smell coffee and tobacco on his breath. "You're being investigated," Dalton said, "and if you keep asking questions, you'll be arrested for obstruction." Elijah closed his eyes for half a second. Then he slowly placed his hands behind his back. The metal cuffs snapped tight around his wrists, too tight. "That's unnecessary," Elijah said through clenched teeth as the cold bit into his skin. Dalton leaned in, voice low. "What's unnecessary is you thinking you get to tell me how to do my job." He guided, no, shoved Elijah toward the patrol car, pressing his palm hard between Elijah's shoulder blades. A car passed by, slowing briefly. Elijah wondered if the driver noticed, or if they would just keep going, like most people did. Dalton opened the rear door and paused. "You got any weapons in the vehicle?" "No, sir." "Any drugs?" "No." "Any reason I shouldn't search your car?" Elijah hesitated again. He knew his rights. He also knew how fragile they felt on the side of a dark highway. "I don't consent to a search, officer." Dalton's eyes hardened. "Oh, we'll see about that." He slammed the door shut, leaving Elijah seated in the back, wrists aching, breath shallow.
From inside the patrol car, Elijah watched Dalton walk back to his sedan, watched him open the driver's door, watched him reach in and pick up the Bible. He held it like it might bite him. He flipped it over once, then twice. The leather cover was cracked and softened with age, pages swollen slightly from years of humidity and use. Dalton opened it. At first he scoffed. Then his expression changed. He flipped a few more pages, slower now. His flashlight beam lingered on something inside. Dalton's posture stiffened. Elijah noticed, even from the back seat. The officer closed the Bible carefully, too carefully. He stood there for a long moment, staring at it. Then he looked back at Elijah. And for the first time since the stop began, Dalton didn't look angry. He looked unsettled.
Officer Dalton stood beside the open driver's door longer than necessary, the Bible resting in his hands like a weight he hadn't expected to pick up. From the back seat of the patrol car, Reverend Elijah Brooks watched him through the plexiglass divider. Years of pastoral counseling had taught Elijah how to read people in silence. He saw the shift clearly, the stiffness in Dalton's shoulders, the way his jaw tightened, the way his thumb traced the edge of the worn leather cover instead of flipping it away in disgust like he had with everything else in the car. Something inside that book had changed the air. Dalton cleared his throat and opened the Bible again. This time, he didn't flip randomly. He turned carefully, as if he already knew where to look, or as if he were afraid of what he might find. Inside the front cover, neatly taped and yellowed with age, was a folded newspaper clipping. The headline was barely legible now, ink faded and creased from being unfolded and refolded countless times. Local pastor leads church after racist attack, refuses to leave town. Dalton frowned and leaned closer under the beam of his flashlight. Below the headline was a black and white photo of a young man standing in front of a small wooden church, arm bandaged, face bruised, but eyes steady. It was Elijah. Younger, thinner, but unmistakably him. Dalton flipped the page. More clippings fell loose, carefully preserved like relics. A photo of a burned-out church sanctuary. Another headline, "Cross Burning Fails to Silence Community Leader." A handwritten note taped beside it, written in careful slanted ink. "Forgive them anyway. Luke 23:34. Dalton swallowed. This wasn't a prop. This wasn't something picked up to look righteous. This Bible had been lived in. From the back seat, Elijah spoke softly, breaking the silence. "That was my first church, Mount Hope Baptist, or what was left of it." Dalton flinched slightly, as if he'd forgotten Elijah was there. "You should put that back," Dalton muttered, more to himself than to Elijah. "Officer," Elijah said gently, "you asked why I carry it." Dalton closed the Bible halfway, but didn't return it yet. His voice came out rougher than before. "You don't look like the kind of man who needs trouble, so why keep reminders like this?" Elijah leaned back against the hard plastic seat, the cuffs biting into his wrists. "Because forgetting is a luxury, and some of us were never afforded it." Dalton exhaled sharply through his nose. He flipped deeper into the Bible. Verses were underlined, margins filled with notes, names written beside prayers. Then he reached the center and stopped. Pressed between the pages of Psalm 34 was a laminated card, creased, cloudy, handled 1,000 times. Dalton read it once, then again. The words were typed, official. Apology Statement, South Carolina State Police, issued 1994. Dalton's brow furrowed. The text beneath read, "We acknowledge the wrongful detention and use of excessive force against Reverend Elijah Brooks during a traffic stop conducted on March 12, 1994. We regret the harm caused and commit to corrective action." Dalton's chest tightened. He checked the date, 1994. He would have been barely out of the academy. Dalton lowered the card slowly. "How many times?" he asked quietly.
Elijah didn't need clarification. Too many to count. That was the only one that ever came with an apology. Dalton's grip tightened around the Bible. "You sued?" "No," answered Elijah. "The department offered it to avoid one." Dalton nodded slowly, shame flickering across his face before being replaced by defensiveness. "So you just keep this, like a trophy?" Elijah's eyes hardened, not angrily, but firmly. "No," he said, "like a reminder of what power can do and what grace must answer." Dalton shut the Bible fully now. He stood there, staring at the cracked leather cover as if it might start speaking on its own. Behind them, another patrol car pulled up. Officer Linda Harris stepped out, glancing between Dalton, the open car door, and Elijah in cuffs. "What's going on, Dalton?" she asked. Dalton straightened quickly. "Routine stop." Driver was swerving. Harris peered into the patrol car, her eyes landing on Elijah. "You okay, sir?" asked Harris. "I will be," Elijah replied calmly. Harris's gaze flicked to the cuffs. "What's the charge?" Dalton hesitated. "Investigating possible impairment." Harris raised an eyebrow. "He look impaired to you?" Dalton's jaw tightened. "No," he admitted. Harris sighed and leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Then why is he cuffed?" Dalton didn't answer right away. Instead, he held up the Bible. Harris glanced at it, not impressed at first, then noticed the loose clippings protruding from the pages. Her expression shifted. She reached out. "May I?" Dalton handed it reluctantly. Harris flipped through slowly, reading the same clippings, the same apology card. Her lips pressed together. "Is this yours?" she asked Elijah. "Yes, ma'am." "You're a pastor?" "For 33 years. Harris nodded once firmly. Then she turned to Dalton. "You need to uncuff him," she said quietly. Dalton stiffened. "I haven't finished." "You have," Harris cut in. "This is going sideways." Dalton glanced at Elijah, then back at Harris. "You didn't see him driving. You didn't feel the tension. I see it now, and I don't like what it looks like." Silence hung heavy between them. Traffic roared past. Dalton's pride warred visibly with something else, doubt perhaps, or memory. Finally, he walked to the back of the patrol car. He opened the door. Elijah met his eyes steadily. Dalton reached for the cuffs. His hands hesitated for half a second, then he unlocked them. The metal clicked open, and Elijah rubbed his wrists slowly, flexing his fingers as feeling returned. "I'm not apologizing," Dalton muttered. Elijah nodded. "I didn't ask you to." Dalton stepped back, uncomfortable. Harris handed the Bible back to Elijah with both hands. "Thank you for carrying this, even when it's heavy." Elijah accepted it, tucking it gently against his chest. Dalton cleared his throat. "You can go," he said gruffly. "Drive safe." Elijah didn't move right away. He stepped out of the patrol car and stood, adjusting his jacket. Then he looked at Dalton. "Officer," Elijah said calmly, "you stopped me for a minor issue." Dalton stiffened again. "But this book," Elijah continued, lifting the Bible slightly, "tells a bigger story, one that didn't start tonight and won't end here." Dalton didn't respond. Elijah nodded politely to Harris, then walked back to his car. As he pulled away, Dalton stood frozen on the shoulder, the red and blue lights still flashing, the night suddenly much quieter than before. Inside the patrol car, Harris exhaled slowly. "You okay, Dalton?" Dalton stared at the dark stretch of road where Elijah had disappeared. "No," he said quietly, and for the first time in a long while, the badge on his chest felt heavier than the gun at his side.
Officer Dalton didn't move for a long time after Reverend Elijah Brooks disappeared down the highway. The patrol lights still spun red and blue, washing the asphalt in restless color, but the world around him felt muted, like someone had turned the volume down on everything except his own thoughts. Linda Harris leaned against her cruiser, arms crossed, watching him carefully. "You want to tell me what that was about?" she asked, not accusing, just steady. Dalton finally exhaled, slow and heavy. "I don't know," he said. "I thought I did, but I don't." Harris tilted her head. "You want to take 5 before we roll?" Dalton nodded.
She stepped back, giving him space. Dalton walked to his cruiser and sat in the driver's seat, hands resting uselessly on his thighs. He stared at the steering wheel like it might offer answers. That Bible, the clippings, the apology card, the calm in the man's voice while sitting in cuffs like it was nothing new. Dalton rubbed his face hard. He'd been trained to see threats, to trust patterns, to assert control early before things escalated. That's what the instructors said. That's what his father had said too. But something about Elijah Brooks hadn't fit the script. The man hadn't raised his voice, hadn't begged, hadn't flinched. He'd looked at Dalton the way Dalton used to look at his own reflection before the job hardened him, like someone who still believed things could be better if people chose right. The radio crackled. Unit 12, status? Dalton grabbed the mic, hesitated, then answered. Unit 12 is clear, he said. No incident. The words tasted strange. Across town, Reverend Elijah Brooks drove slowly, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the Bible in the passenger seat. His wrists still ached, not badly, just enough to remind him. He had seen Officer Dalton's eyes when the cuffs came off. That look, Elijah knew it well. It was the look of a man standing at the edge of something uncomfortable, the moment right before denial hardens or growth begins. Elijah whispered a quiet prayer as the road stretched ahead. Lord, he said softly, don't let bitterness win tonight. At home, his modest brick house sat quiet under the streetlight. The porch light flicked on as he pulled into the driveway. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old books. Elijah hung his jacket carefully, placed the Bible back on its familiar spot by the door, and sat down at the small kitchen table. Only then did his hands begin to tremble. He bowed his head, not because he was afraid, but because the past had a way of rushing back when invited. 30 years earlier, different road, different officer, same lights. Back then, he hadn't been a pastor yet, just a seminary student with dreams too big for the town he lived in. They'd slammed him against the hood, pressed a knee into his back, called him names they'd later deny. No body cam, no witnesses willing to speak, just pain and silence. The apology card in the Bible came years later, after pressure, after quiet threats of legal action. It hadn't erased anything, but Elijah kept it, because forgetting felt like surrender. Across the city, Officer Dalton sat alone in the locker room after his shift ended. Most nights he joked with the guys, grabbed a beer, laughed off the day. Tonight, he went straight to his locker and sat on the bench, elbows on knees, staring at the floor. The echo of Elijah's voice wouldn't leave him. This book tells a bigger story. Dalton pulled out his phone and opened the department database. He typed, Brooks, Elijah. The results surprised him. Commendations, community outreach, youth programs, interfaith initiatives. No priors, no warnings, no complaints. Dalton scrolled further. There it was. 1994. Internal review. Use of force. Sustained. His chest tightened. He clicked. The report was brief, sanitized, stripped of emotion. But the names of the officers involved made his stomach drop. One of them was retired now. Another was his academy instructor, the man who'd taught him how to control a stop. Dalton locked his phone and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Was this what he had inherited? Not just a badge, but a pattern? At the same hour, Reverend Elijah Brooks sat in his study, flipping slowly through the Bible. He stopped at Psalm 34 again. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. A knock sounded at the door. Elijah looked up, surprised. It was late. He stood and opened it carefully. A woman stood on the porch, late 50s, calm eyes, wearing a denim jacket over a blouse. Reverend Brooks? She asked. Yes? My name is Angela Wright. I'm with the Community Oversight Board. Elijah nodded slowly. I know who you are. Angela hesitated. I got a call tonight, anonymous, said you were stopped. Elijah didn't answer right away. Was it improper? She asked, gently. Elijah considered the question carefully. Not illegal, but not innocent either. Angela nodded. That's usually where the truth lives. She handed him a card. If you decide you want to talk, we'll listen. Elijah took the card. Thank you, he said. She turned to leave, then paused. Reverend, she added, it matters when people like you keep standing. Elijah watched her walk down the steps. He closed the door quietly and leaned his forehead against it. Across town, Dalton couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his wife already asleep beside him. He kept seeing the Bible, the apology card, the calm in the man's voice while sitting in cuffs like it was nothing new. At 2:17 a.m., he sat up and swung his legs over the bed. He walked to the kitchen, poured water, and stood staring out the window. What if I was wrong? He whispered to no one. The question felt dangerous, but it also felt honest. The next morning, headlines began to circulate online. Not viral, not explosive, just enough to stir unease. Local pastor describes unsettling traffic stop, no charges filed. Dalton saw it on his phone while sitting in his cruiser. His stomach dropped. Linda Harris pulled up beside him and rolled down her window. You see the news? She asked. Dalton nodded. They're asking questions now. Internal affairs, too. Dalton closed his eyes briefly. I deserve that, he said. Harris studied him. You going to get defensive or get honest? Dalton swallowed. I don't know how to do this the right way. Harris nodded once. Then start by not doing it the old way. Across the city, Reverend Elijah Brooks stood in his pulpit that Sunday morning, looking out at a congregation that had seen him through worse. He didn't mention the stop. He didn't name the officer. Instead, he spoke calmly. Sometimes, God puts us face to face with our own reflection, not to shame us, but to invite us to change. In the back pew, a man sat quietly, head bowed low. Officer Mark Dalton. He didn't know why he had come. He only knew he needed to listen. And for the first time since putting on the badge, he felt something unfamiliar pressing against his chest. Not anger, not fear, conviction. And it was heavier than any uniform he had ever worn.
Officer Mark Dalton sat in the back pew long after the last hymn faded. The church emptied slowly, handshakes, quiet laughter, the soft scrape of shoes against wooden floors. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, casting muted blues and golds across the aisle. Dalton didn't move. He felt like if he stood too quickly, something inside him might crack open in front of everyone. Reverend Elijah Brooks noticed him before Dalton noticed he was being watched. Elijah didn't approach right away. He spoke with an elderly woman near the front, then a young couple holding hands too tightly. He moved with the patience of a man who understood timing, the kind learned only through years of listening more than speaking. Finally, he walked down the aisle. "Officer Dalton," he said quietly. Dalton looked up, startled, then stood abruptly. "Reverend, Elijah raised a hand gently. "You don't owe me words yet." They stood there, the space between them thick with everything that hadn't been said. "I didn't come as a cop today, Dalton," finally said. "I came because I needed to hear that." Elijah nodded. "Truth has a way of finding the ears that are ready." Dalton swallowed. "I read your file." Elijah's expression didn't change, but something hardened briefly behind his eyes. "And?" he asked. "And you shouldn't have gone through what you did. Not then, not now." Silence. Not the awkward kind, the heavy, honest kind. "I didn't stop you because of who you are. At least, that's what I told myself." Elijah studied him carefully. "And now?" Dalton exhaled shakily. "Now I'm not so sure." That answer cost him something. He could feel it. Elijah nodded once. "That uncertainty is uncomfortable," he said, "but it's also sacred ground." They walked together toward the exit. Outside, the autumn air was crisp. Leaves skittered across the steps like nervous thoughts. "You know," Elijah said, "I didn't keep that apology card because it fixed anything.
Dalton looked at him. I kept it because it reminded me that accountability is possible, even if it comes late. Dalton nodded slowly. Internal Affairs called me this morning. Elijah wasn't surprised. They're opening a review. My stop, my conduct, my record. And how do you feel about that? Elijah asked. Dalton hesitated. Relieved, I admitted, and terrified. Elijah smiled faintly. Both make sense. Across town, the department was anything but calm. Captain Reyes stood at the front of the briefing room, jaw clenched, eyes sharp. This is not a witch hunt, but it is a reckoning. Murmurs rippled through the officers. We are reviewing conduct, body cam footage, stop justifications, complaint patterns. Dalton felt eyes on him, some curious, some cold. One officer leaned over and whispered, "You really gonna let a preacher stir all this up?" Dalton didn't respond, because that wasn't the truth. Later that afternoon, Dalton sat in a small interview room across from two internal affairs investigators. The red recording light blinked on. "Officer Dalton," one investigator said, "walk us through the stop." Dalton did. Every detail, every assumption, every moment he'd chosen control over curiosity. "And why did you request backup?" the investigator asked. Dalton paused. "Because I was uncomfortable," he said honestly. "And why were you uncomfortable?" The room felt smaller. Because he didn't act the way I expected, and instead of adjusting my expectations, I escalated. The investigators exchanged glances. Outside the department, words spread faster than the official statements. Social media lit up, cautiously at first, then louder. Pastors stopped for minor issue, calm demeanor, handcuffed anyway. Another routine stop? Church groups, community leaders, retired officers, everyone had an opinion. Some defended Dalton fiercely. Others demanded accountability. At home that night, Dalton's wife Karen sat across from him at the kitchen table. "You okay?" she asked. Dalton rubbed his temples. "I don't know." Karen reached across the table and took his hand. "Then start with honesty." He met her eyes. "I don't think I've been as fair as I thought I was," he said quietly. Karen squeezed his hand. "That doesn't make you weak." Across town, Reverend Brooks met with Angela Wright at a small cafe. "You didn't file a complaint," Angela noted. "No," said Elijah. "I chose to speak instead." Angela nodded. "That choice carries weight." Elijah stared into his coffee. "I don't want revenge. I want change." Angela leaned forward. "Then you should know, your stop has reopened older cases." Elijah looked up sharply. "Older?" "Yes," she said. "Patterns, names, similar reports." Elijah closed his eyes briefly. "Sometimes," Angela continued, "one moment cracks the dam." Back at the department, tension thickened. Locker room conversations went quiet when Dalton entered. A few officers avoided him. Others watched carefully. One afternoon, an older sergeant pulled Dalton aside. "You're stirring waters you don't understand," he warned. "You push this too far, you won't like where it ends." Dalton met his gaze. "I'm already there." The sergeant scoffed and walked away. That night, Dalton sat alone in his cruiser after shift, engine idling. He thought about his father, a former officer who taught him that loyalty mattered more than reflection. "You back your own," his father had always said. But no one had taught him what to do when your own was wrong. At the same hour, Reverend Brooks stood in his sanctuary alone, lights dimmed, Bible open. He knelt at the altar, not to ask for victory, but for restraint. Let this not become about pride. Let it become about healing. The next week, the department announced mandatory bias and de-escalation retraining. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some applauded, some bristled. Dalton attended the first session quietly. He listened differently now. When the instructor spoke about assumptions, Dalton felt the words land heavier. During a break, Linda Harris sat beside him. "You're different lately," she said. Dalton nodded. "I had to be." She smiled faintly. Growth usually costs something. As the investigation continued, the city watched, not for a verdict, but for a signal. Would the badge protect itself again, or would it finally look inward? And in the quiet space between two men, one in a uniform, one with a Bible, something fragile but powerful was taking shape. Not forgiveness yet, not resolution, but the beginning of truth. And truth, once stirred, doesn't stay contained.
The city didn't explode all at once. It simmered, like a pot left too long on low heat, quiet at first, then dangerous. By the end of the week, Charleston felt different. Not louder, not angrier on the surface, but sharper. Conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. People leaned in closer when they talked. Everyone knew something was happening, even if they didn't yet agree on what it meant. The headline hit Friday morning. Traffic stop raises questions about policing and bias. Internal review underway. No names in the title, no photos, just enough ambiguity to let people project their own beliefs into the empty spaces. By noon, it didn't matter. Everyone knew. Officer Mark Dalton, Reverend Elijah Brooks, Highway 17. At the precinct, phones rang non-stop. Reporters, city council aides, community leaders, retired officers offering unsolicited advice. Captain Reyes shut his office door and didn't open it for hours. Inside the bullpen, officers clustered in small groups, voices low. "This is ridiculous," one muttered. "Guy didn't even get arrested." "Doesn't matter," another replied. "Perception's already set." Dalton sat at his desk, unread emails stacking up, unread texts buzzing in his pocket. He didn't join the conversations. He didn't need to. He could feel where most of them landed. Loyalty first. Questions later, if at all. One officer finally said it out loud. "You really think this is going to help us?" he asked Dalton bluntly. "All this soul-searching crap?" Dalton looked up slowly. "I think pretending nothing's wrong hasn't helped either." The officer scoffed. "You sound like them now." Dalton didn't ask who them was. He already knew. Across town, Reverend Brooks sat at his dining table with a yellow legal pad and a mug of tea gone cold. Angela Wright sat across from him, her phone face down for once. "They want you at the council meeting Monday. Public comment." Elijah rubbed his thumb along the edge of the paper. "They want a spectacle." "They want a voice," Angela corrected. "And right now, yours carries weight." Elijah sighed. "Weight can crush as easily as it can lift." Angela leaned forward. "Then don't carry it alone." By Sunday morning, the pews were full. Too full. People stood along the walls. Reporters lingered outside, pretending to admire the architecture. Cameras stayed respectfully back. For now. Elijah stepped to the pulpit, his Bible open. He didn't mention the stop right away. He spoke about accountability, about humility, about the difference between authority and righteousness. He said calmly, "The badge and the Bible share something in common. Neither protects you from judgment. They only make your responsibility heavier." Murmurs rippled through the room. "Elijah," someone whispered later, "you're brave." He shook his head. "I'm tired." That afternoon, an op-ed appeared online. "We must support our officers, not tear them down." By evening, a counter-opinion followed. Accountability is not an attack. Social media did what it always did. It picked sides. At home, Dalton scrolled through comments he knew he shouldn't read. "He's a traitor. He's finally telling the truth. This is why cops don't speak up. About time one did." Karen watched him from the doorway. "Put it down," she said gently. Dalton exhaled and locked the phone. "I don't recognize the department anymore," he said quietly. Karen tilted her head. "Or maybe you're finally seeing it clearly." Monday came heavy. City Hall overflowed.
uniforms, clergy, activists, retirees, cameras. Dalton stood in the back, out of uniform. He hadn't been told to attend, but he needed to hear it. When Elijah stepped to the microphone, the room quieted. "I didn't come here to accuse. I came here to testify." A hush fell. "I was stopped for a minor issue. I complied. I was respectful. And still, the situation escalated." A few heads nodded, a few arms crossed tighter. But this is not about one officer. It's about what happens when fear replaces curiosity, when authority forgets restraint. He paused. And it's about what happens next. Applause broke out, uneven but real. A council member cleared her throat. "What would you like to see change, Reverend?" Elijah didn't hesitate. "Training that goes beyond checklists, accountability that doesn't hide behind procedure, and officers who feel safe enough to admit when they're wrong." Eyes flicked towards Dalton. He didn't look away. After the meeting, chaos resumed. Reporters surged. Questions flew. Dalton slipped out a side door. Outside, a man leaned against the railing, waiting. "You're the cop," the man said, not angry, curious. Dalton nodded. "I am." The man studied him. "You're getting heat from both sides." Dalton gave a tired smile. "Feels like it." The man extended his hand. "Name's Thomas, retired, 32 years on the force." Dalton shook it. "Then you know how this ends." Thomas nodded slowly. "Yeah, usually not well." He leaned closer. "But sometimes it cracks something open." That night, Internal Affairs released a preliminary statement. The review was expanding. Patterns, prior complaints, use of force reports. The word systemic appeared for the first time. Inside the precinct, silence grew heavier. Some officers avoided Dalton entirely now. Others watched him like he was a ticking clock. One afternoon, Captain Reyes called him in. "You understand what this costs?" Reyes asked bluntly. Dalton nodded. "Yes, sir." Reyes leaned back. "Then why do it?" Dalton answered honestly. "Because I don't want to retire pretending." Reyes studied him for a long moment. "Go home," he said finally. "Tomorrow's going to be worse." He was right. By midweek, protests formed, peaceful but firm. Signs read, "Respect is not optional." "Justice doesn't threaten good policing." Across the street, counter-protesters gathered. Tension stretched thin. Elijah stood between groups one evening, speaking quietly, urging calm. Dalton watched from his car, heart pounding. He realized something then. This wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't even about Elijah. It was about what the city would choose to protect: comfort or truth. And once a city starts choosing sides, there's no going back to silence. Only forward into whatever comes next.
The pressure didn't ease. It shifted, like a storm that stops breaking windows and starts flooding foundations instead. By the time Thursday arrived, the city was no longer arguing about what happened on Highway 17. That question had been dissected, replayed, and shouted into exhaustion. Now the arguments were deeper, uglier, and far more dangerous. What does accountability really mean? Who gets protected when the truth hurts? And who pays the price when silence finally breaks? Inside the police department, the walls felt closer together. Locker room conversations stopped the moment Mark Dalton entered. Chairs scraped, radios clicked louder than necessary. Not hostility exactly, something colder. Caution. He had become a variable, and police culture hates variables. A memo landed in every officer's inbox that morning. Mandatory bias and de-escalation training, all sworn personnel. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement of why. Just an order.
Some officers rolled their eyes, some slammed lockers shut, some smiled thin, knowing smiles. At lunch, Dalton sat alone. Officer Jenna Ruiz hovered nearby, tray in hand, debating. Finally, she sat across from him. "You holdin' up?" she asked quietly. Dalton shrugged. "Depends who you ask." Ruiz hesitated. "You didn't have to say what you said. About Elijah, about everything." Dalton met her eyes. "But it was true." She nodded once. "That's what scares them." Across town, Reverend Elijah Brooks felt a different kind of pressure, softer on the surface, heavier underneath. His voicemail filled faster than he could clear it. Supporters, critics, old friends resurfacing, strangers asking him to speak for them. "Reverend, will you attend our rally? Pastor, can you condemn the police? Sir, do you believe all cops are bad?" Elijah answered none of those questions directly. He returned calls when he could, ignored those meant to provoke, prayed longer than usual. On Wednesday night, he stood alone in the sanctuary, lights dimmed, Bible resting open on the pulpit. He ran his fingers along the margins, notes written decades ago. Fear had a sound, he realized. It sounded like division disguised as certainty. Angela Wright joined him quietly. "You don't owe everyone your voice," she said. Elijah smiled faintly. "I know, but I owe them my honesty." She leaned against the pew. "They're building you into a symbol." Elijah sighed. "Symbols get broken." Thursday afternoon, the leak hit. Someone inside the department had sent internal disciplinary data to a local journalist. Not names at first, just numbers. Traffic stops by race, search rates, escalation frequency. The patterns were unmistakable. By evening, the story was everywhere. Data suggests disparities in local policing practices. Captain Reyes called an emergency meeting. The room buzzed with tension. "This was confidential," he said sharply. "Someone here violated protocol." Eyes darted. Dalton felt a dozen glances land on him. He didn't flinch. "I don't care who leaked it. I care about what it says, because now we can't pretend anymore." A hand shot up. "So what, we're the villains now?" Reyes exhaled. "No, but denial is no longer an option." After the meeting, Dalton found a note on his desk. "Watch your back." No signature. At home, Karen noticed immediately. "You're quieter than usual," she said. Dalton stared at the wall. "I don't know who I can trust anymore." Karen reached for his hand. "Then trust your conscience. It hasn't failed you yet." Friday brought another escalation. A retired officer gave an interview on local TV. "Back in my day," the man said, "we didn't second-guess every move. That's why crime stayed down." The host nodded sympathetically. Elijah watched the clip later, shaking his head. "Back in your day," he murmured, "people were just quieter about the pain." That night, a brick shattered the church's side window. No note, no message, just broken glass. Elijah swept it up himself before morning service, not out of pride, out of resolve. On Saturday, the training sessions began. Roomfuls of officers sat stiff-backed while instructors spoke about implicit bias, historical context, escalation curves. Some listened, some resisted, some pretended. Dalton spoke once. "I didn't come here to be blamed," he said evenly. "I came here to learn what I missed." The room went silent. Later, in the parking lot, a younger officer approached him. "Sir, my dad thinks you're ruining the department." Dalton studied him. "And what do you think?" The officer swallowed. "I think I don't want to become someone I can't recognize." Dalton nodded. "Then you're already ahead." By Sunday, Elijah's sermon was shorter than usual. He spoke about Peter denying Christ, about fear, about restoration. "Failure isn't the end," he said gently. "Refusal to change is." Afterwards, a woman approached him, white hair, trembling hands. "My son's an officer," she whispered. "He's scared." Elijah took her hands. "Tell him fear doesn't make him weak. Silence does."
That evening, Dalton received a call from Internal Affairs. They wanted a formal statement, on record, under oath. He sat in his car for a long moment after the call ended. This was the point of no return. At the same time, Elijah knelt by his bed, praying not for victory, but for clarity. Two men, bound by different callings, standing at the same crossroads. Both understood now, truth doesn't ask permission, and once spoken, it demands a response. The city was holding its breath, and whatever came next would either deepen the divide or finally begin to heal it.
The statement room smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. Officer Mark Dalton sat alone at the metal table, hands folded, spine straight, the posture of a man trained to stay composed even when everything inside him was tightening. A small red light blinked on the recorder in front of him, steady and unforgiving. Internal Affairs would be in any minute. For the first time in his 22 years on the force, Mark felt the weight of the badge, not as pride, but as gravity. He thought about the night of the traffic stop again, not the shouting, not the cameras, but the moment before any of it happened, the split second where fear could have been checked, where assumptions could have been questioned. That was where the truth lived. The door opened. Two investigators entered, one older, one younger. Neither smiled. "Officer Dalton," the older one said, "this statement is voluntary, but once given, it becomes part of the official record." Mark nodded. "I understand. Do you wish to proceed?" "Yes." Across the city, Reverend Elijah Brooks sat at his kitchen table, Bible open but unread. His phone buzzed continuously beside his coffee mug. He had stopped answering hours ago. Angela watched him carefully. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said. Elijah exhaled slowly. "I know, but I don't get to choose who listens, only what I say." That morning, a national network had requested an interview. So had a civil rights group. So had a police union representative, politely worded, tightly controlled. Everyone wanted something different from him. A symbol, a shield, a weapon. Elijah wanted none of it. At the station, the questions came steadily. Why did you intervene? What made you speak publicly? Were you pressured by outside groups? Mark answered plainly. I intervened because I saw a situation escalating unnecessarily. I spoke because silence would have made me complicit. No one pressured me. This was my decision. The younger investigator scribbled notes, eyes flicking up occasionally. And if this damages your career? The older one asked. Mark paused. Then that's the cost. The room went quiet. That answer wasn't in the manual. By noon, rumors had already spread through the department. Dalton's cooperating. Dalton's throwing people under the bus. Dalton's angling for a book deal. None of it was true, and none of it mattered. At church, Elijah met with the deacons. Some were anxious, others angry. They threw a brick through the window. One said, "What if it gets worse?" Elijah nodded. "Then we fix more windows." "That's not the point," another snapped. "They're testing us." Elijah folded his hands. "Then let them see what we're made of." That afternoon, the body cam footage was officially released in full, unedited, context included. The nation watched again, but this time slower, clearer. They heard the officer's tone. They saw Elijah's hands. They noticed the Bible, worn and marked, sitting quietly on the passenger seat. They noticed Mark Dalton stepping in. The reaction shifted, still divided, but no longer simple. Some commentators changed their tone. Perhaps, one admitted on air, this wasn't about defiance, but dignity. Others doubled down. Respect goes both ways, a panelist argued. Uniforms deserve obedience. Elijah watched none of it. He was busy answering a knock at the church door. A young man stood there, early 20s, police haircut, nervous posture. I'm Officer Lewis," he said. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." Elijah studied him for a moment, then stepped aside.
Come in." They sat in the pews. "My dad says you should have just complied, but my mom says you remind her of her father. He was a preacher too." Elijah smiled gently. "Both can be true." Lewis swallowed. "I'm scared I'll mess up, that I'll freeze or assume." Elijah leaned forward. "Then promise yourself this: never stop seeing the human first." Lewis nodded, eyes shining. At sunset, Mark returned home to find reporters outside his building. Karen gripped his arm. "You don't have to say anything." "I know," he said softly, "but maybe I should." He stepped forward. "I didn't speak out because I hate this job. I spoke because I love it, because I want my badge to mean protection, not fear." One reporter shouted, "Do you regret intervening?" Mark didn't hesitate. "No." Inside the department, pressure mounted. The union released a statement, carefully worded but firm. While accountability is important, officers must not undermine one another publicly. Captain Reyes read it twice, then closed the document. He called Mark into his office the next morning. "You've stirred up something bigger than both of us," Reyes said. "I know." Reyes sighed. "I won't lie, this makes things complicated." "I didn't expect simple," Mark replied. Reyes studied him. "Neither did I, but here's the truth. If we bury this, it'll rot us from the inside." Mark said nothing. "You may face consequences," Reyes continued, "but you also may have started something necessary." That afternoon, Elijah agreed to one interview, just one. He sat across from the journalist, hands folded, voice steady. "Do you see this as a racial issue?" she asked. "I see it as a human one. Race shapes it, fear fuels it, but dignity should guide it. Do you have any words for officers watching this?" Elijah paused. "Be brave enough to listen." That clip went viral, not for outrage, for quiet, for the way his voice never rose, for the way he never blamed, for the way he spoke truth without bitterness. In homes across the country, older Americans nodded slowly. That night, Mark and Elijah spoke on the phone for the first time. "I didn't expect this," Mark admitted. Elijah cluttered softly. "Neither did I." "Do you think it'll make a difference?" Elijah considered. "Cracks don't look like change, but they let the light in." They hung up knowing neither could turn back now. The walls were cracking, and what came next would determine whether the system healed or collapsed under the weight of its own resistance.
The courthouse steps were already crowded when Reverend Elijah Brooks arrived. Not loud, not chaotic, just full. People stood shoulder to shoulder, retirees in press jackets, young parents holding sleepy children, veterans wearing caps stitched with memories, church elders with Bibles tucked under their arms. They weren't there to shout. They were there to witness. Elijah paused at the bottom of the steps, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his bones. He had preached for 40 years, stood at gravesides and weddings, comforted strangers in hospital rooms. But this felt different. This wasn't about faith alone. This was about truth meeting consequence. Angela squeezed his hand. "You ready?" Elijah nodded, as ready as a man can be when he doesn't control the outcome. Inside, the courtroom hummed with quiet tension. Wood benches creaked as people sat. Cameras were banned, but the presence of the public said enough. Officer Mark Dalton entered through a side door, uniform pressed, face calm but eyes tired. He spotted Elijah and gave a small nod. Elijah returned it. Two men from different worlds, bound by one moment neither could undo. The judge entered. "All rise." The case was called. Not a criminal trial, but a disciplinary hearing that had grown into something much larger: policy, conduct, accountability, and precedent. The officer who had initiated the traffic stop sat stiffly with his attorney. His jaw was tight, eyes fixed forward.
When asked to testify, Elijah stood slowly. He placed his hand on the Bible, the same one that had been sitting on his passenger seat that night. Its leather cover was worn thin, pages curled at the edges, notes scribbled in margins from decades of sermons and prayers. "Do you swear to tell the truth?" the clerk asked. "I do," Elijah said, voice steady. He spoke plainly about the stop, the tone, the escalation, the fear, not loud or dramatic, but real. He did not exaggerate. He did not accuse. He did not insult. He simply described what happened when dignity was questioned. The defense attorney tried to rattle him. "Isn't it true you could have avoided this by complying immediately?" Elijah met his gaze. "I did comply. I provided my license. I kept my hands visible. I spoke calmly." "So why the confrontation?" Elijah paused. "Because compliance is not the same as submission, and respect should not require silence." A murmur moved through the courtroom. When Mark was called, the room grew still. He testified to what he saw, the officer's posture, the rising tension, the unnecessary aggression. "You're saying your fellow officer was wrong?" "I'm saying the situation was mishandled and that I failed to intervene sooner." That admission landed hard. The officer's attorney objected. The judge overruled. Outside, word spread quickly. By noon, the crowd had doubled. When the ruling came, no one breathed. The judge spoke carefully, deliberately. "The evidence shows a pattern of conduct inconsistent with departmental standards. While no criminal charges are warranted, disciplinary action is necessary." The officer was suspended without pay. Mandatory retraining ordered, a formal reprimand placed on record. It wasn't the harshest outcome. It wasn't nothing. Elijah closed his eyes briefly. Justice, he knew, rarely arrived whole. But this was a step. Afterward, reporters surged, but Elijah declined every microphone. Instead, he walked across the street to a small park where people had gathered quietly. He stood on a bench, not as a preacher, but as a neighbor. "I didn't come here to win. I came here to tell the truth, and truth doesn't belong to one side." Someone shouted, "What now?" Elijah smiled faintly. "Now we keep living like tomorrow matters." Mark stood at the edge of the crowd, listening. That evening, the department announced changes: new de-escalation training, community ride-alongs, body cam reviews with civilian oversight. Not because of pressure, because ignoring the moment had become impossible. Mark received his own notice, commended for integrity, reassigned temporarily, promotion postponed, not revoked. Karen hugged him when he told him. "I can live with that," she said. "So can I," Mark replied. At church the following Sunday, the pews overflowed. Some familiar faces, many new ones. Elijah preached from Micah. "What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly." He closed his Bible and looked out. This isn't about a traffic stop. It's about how we see one another when power enters the room. After service, an older white man approached hesitantly. "I used to think people were exaggerating. I don't anymore." Elijah nodded. "Thank you for saying that." A week later, Elijah received a letter, no return address. Inside was a simple note. "I watched the video. I saw myself in that officer. I'm trying to do better." Elijah folded it carefully and placed it inside his Bible. Months passed. The headlines faded, but something remained. Mark began teaching at the academy, not tactics, but judgment. Elijah started a community forum at the church, officers and civilians sitting in the same room, no uniforms, no pulpits, listening. One evening, Mark attended quietly. Elijah spotted him. "Glad you came." "Me too," Mark replied.
They sat side by side as a young woman spoke about fear and an older officer spoke about burnout. No shouting, no slogans, just truth traded carefully. As the night ended, Mark said, "You know, I used to think doing the right thing meant following rules." Elijah smiled. "Sometimes it means rewriting them." They stood outside under the streetlights. Two men, changed, not by force, but by conscience. And somewhere, in a quiet neighborhood, an older viewer turned off the television and sat for a moment longer than usual, thinking, not about anger, but about courage. Because sometimes the biggest story isn't the stop itself. It's what happens when someone finally refuses to look away.